Hey, everybody. So excited to have second-time podcast guest, Melissa Ebken. Melissa was on, I think, 2 years ago now. We got connected through a mutual friend, good friend Molly Grisham, who's a 5-time guest of the show because we actually did a 4-part series on some things, and I'm going to have Molly back on. She connected us. I'm like, I got to have Melissa on. Melissa, so glad you're back. Of everybody listening, Melissa is, I mean, this is just a small, this is just a sliver of what you are, but for the purposes of our conversation today, you're an author, you're a coach, you are a pastor, you're a podcaster, and you're a Cubs fan.
Rabid Cubs fan.
Rabid and proud Cubs fan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you have a big potentially market-setting contract coming around with Stroman. I was reading about, like, it's like reset the free agency market depending on how that goes. Like the dollars are insane. I can't even believe it.
Yes, and I am on team sign him.
Sign him, yeah. You're like, well, it's not your $175 million or whatever. So you're like, yeah, whatever.
For sure. Yeah. What else are you going to do with it, right?
Yeah. What else are you going to do with $175 million other than give it to a dude to throw every 5 days, every 5 games? Yeah. And win.
Absolutely.
So, Melissa, let's talk a little bit about how you came back here. I heard that you were up to some cool stuff, and I was looking through my list. I'm like, hey, I need to have Melissa come back on. And today we're just going to have a conversation about the topic of pursuing uncomfortable.
Jason, thank you for having me back. My life has changed in ways I can't describe, having been a cool person. So thank you for that. That initial interview has made all things possible. So thank you. And I'm sure that will ripple through again, being a 2-time guest now.
I like it as a pastor. You're like, what's the verse? It's like all things are possible through him. And then it's also all things are possible through being on the podcast for the first time. Like,
absolutely. Oh man.
Wow. I feel like now that's a lot to live up
to. So no pressure.
And also no pride cometh before the fall at all either. Like none of that.
You know what?
This is fine.
I do humility better than anyone else ever has. If I wrote a book on humility, it would be an immediate bestseller.
It would be the best-selling. It would be the greatest book on humility of all time.
Absolutely.
Oh, man. Melissa's good. Yeah, well, so you can already all tell, for those of you who didn't listen to our episode last time, Melissa we're just going to improv this bad boy. We're going to have a fun conversation and probably get a little serious, too, about what that means, pursuing uncomfortable in a variety of contexts. And as I mentioned, you operate in a variety of contexts. You operate as a pastor. You operate as a podcaster. You are a published author with a soon-to-be coming book. You're a coach and you're a consultant. So let's just get into it. Pursuing uncomfortable. If we were talking to a 5-year-old, and they would probably know what that means if they're advanced, what that means from like a pain, physical. But I don't believe that's what you're meaning. And maybe you are as well. Pursuing uncomfortable, define that for us, please. Like, what do you mean by that?
Jason, in 25 years of ministry, I've seen a tremendous difference in folks who are willing to lean into the difficult situations and experiences in their lives and really work through that to overcome it. The opposite of that is people who just live with the pain of what's present instead of pursuing it and overcoming it. That's the essence of everything I do. There are a lot of different titles we can throw around, but basically it all comes down to holding space for someone to be fully present in order to grow themselves and to grow their life purpose.
Yeah. So Melissa, what would be an example from your work in ministry or really in work anywhere of what do people choose if they don't choose to pursue the uncomfortable? They're making a choice. What is the choice they're making instead?
Well, the choice is in everything we experience in life, from the really tiny things to the big things. So for instance, if you're struggling with finances, it's uncomfortable living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
It's also uncomfortable to set up a system to grow out of that. So you're choosing which uncomfortable you prefer.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable to live with grief and negative emotions. It's also uncomfortable to embrace them and heal from them. So again, you're choosing which uncomfortable you want to have in your life.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable to not grow personally and professionally. If you have a work situation where, say, public speaking or doing presentations or something of that nature is preventing you from progressing, you're being uncomfortable staying where you are and living with that fear, or you can be uncomfortable in embracing it and overcoming it. So again, you're always choosing which uncomfortable you want in your life.
You ready to go deep right away?
Absolutely.
2 coaches here. Melissa, can you give us an example of somewhere in your life that you are not pursuing the uncomfortable?
Where I am not.
Where you are not. And you can ask me the same thing because we like for any of us to sit here and go, you know what? I just pursue the uncomfortable. Like humans don't really work that way. So I'm curious if you can give us an example from your life, big, small, doesn't matter. And I can think of, as you were talking, I'm like, I was making a list in my head of where I am not doing that either. So I'm curious if you've got any place where you are not pursuing the uncomfortable. And then let's talk about the reverse of where you've learned that to pursue that in like something specific. So is there I guess the question really is there a place that you're present to that you're not pursuing the uncomfortable?
For sure. The first thing that comes to mind is nutrition. I know what my body needs to feel fantastic. I've experienced it, but to do it intentionally and over a long term, man, I struggle with that.
So hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that there's some emotional business that's incomplete that's holding me back from that. So until I'm willing to explore that and wrestle that demon, if you will, then that's going to persist. The other side of that coin is working out. And I have begun doing that consistently. The more consistently I do that, the more the other pieces tend to fall into place.
Yep.
So again, it's not doing it, but it's being consistent in doing it over time. Yeah. So those are 2 right off the bat. The second, and this is for every single person on the planet. Well, only the people on the planet that are breathing. If you're not breathing, you're not struggling with this. Yeah. But for every person on the planet,
those are probably the same people who will be listening to this podcast. And if you're not breathing, you're not going to be listening anyway. So everybody listening, this is you.
For sure. There is always an area of forgiveness that needs to be addressed, whether it's within yourself or you're holding on to something that someone else has done. There are always, always, always those areas in our lives. And I'm going to tell you how you know when you have completed that work with someone else. If you can walk into a local diner where you're expecting to meet a friend, let's just say, Jason, I'm going to meet you for lunch at this cafe, blah, blah, blah. I walk in, I'm a little early. I'm going to go get a table and wait for you. But I walk in and I see that person.
Yep.
Now, do I have a visceral reaction? Then that tells me I still have some unfinished business.
Yeah. So Melissa, love that. Yes. We can all identify with that. What's the next step? If you have a visceral reaction, let's say one of your parishioners or somebody you're coaching comes to you and says, hey, I got this actually happened to me. You say, hey, there's some unfinished business. What's the next step that you'd recommend that people pursue?
Well, the first and biggie is recognizing it. That's the first thing. And then second is spending some time with it, just sitting with it, with that uncomfortable visceral reaction and examining why it is triggering you. When you can understand why it is triggering you, then you can do the work to heal it. If there's someone that always just rubs you the wrong way, that always annoys you, that when you see that person, you just clench a little bit, there's something inside of you that person reminds you of. So acknowledging that and then doing some inner work of what is it that's being triggered within me.
So brutal.
First.
You remind me of an exercise I did during my coach training program. They had us go around the room. And this is in person in 2019. We went around and you say, hey, then there's 18 people. And you say, hey, I want you to go around and don't say it, the person who triggers you the most. And I want you to write down what it is that's triggering about that person. You do it and they don't tell you why. And then they go, okay, and now when you go and look at your list of what it is that trigger about that person, what is it about you on that list that you can't be with? And everybody in this like, oh, and you're like, and then you're like, oh, because it reminds me of my mom or my dad. And then you're like, oh, because that's like reminds me of me. No, yeah, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm turning into my father or my mother, or oh, they talk too much, and like, oh, I know that's how I would like to be if I just decided not to take my filter off. So instead, I'm like holding myself back, and that was one of my things. And man, it is so true that yeah, there are going to be people that are just not our people. I mean, and that's I think that's great. That's one of the big breakthroughs I've had is like some people just aren't going to be your people.
Absolutely.
No matter what. And they don't have to trigger you, but you're just like, yeah, that we're never, like they're in it for a season, or that season might be an hour. In a podcast, that season might be a certain amount of time. But the idea of like, oh my God, that person's so annoying, or there's such a trigger, is like, yeah, what is it about you that they're triggering? Because if they don't trigger, if people annoy you, but they don't really like annoying, but not really triggering, I think there's a difference where you're like, oh, that person's slow in front of me in line, but then like never do it, versus like, I walk into the diner and then they are, and I have a visceral reaction because I don't want to make eye contact. You're like, oh boy, that's good. Oof.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing, Jason, there's more and more research coming out about this. We know that our bodies, minds, and spirits are connected.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research coming out from people like Johns Hopkins. We give them a lot of credit for knowing what they're talking about, or Mayo Clinic. Yeah. Again, a lot of credit for knowing what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And they have found a lot of empirical evidence that supports that the more we hold on to grudges and the more we hold on to these things, the worse our health outcomes.
Oh, absolutely.
The more grudges we hold on to, we're going to have heart problems, diabetes, anxiety, all of those things.
Yeah.
That doing the emotional, spiritual work of healing from grudges benefits our physical health. And, intuitively, that just makes sense.
Yeah.
Because we feel it. When you have that visceral reaction, when you see someone, it's your body reacting, and it's secreting hormones and things. It's doing stuff that isn't beneficial for you. So clearing all of that out improves not only our mental health, our spiritual health, but also our physical health.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Let's talk about, I'm trying to think where I want to go with this. There's so many threads to pull on here.
Well, Jason, while you're thinking about that, let me ask you, what is the uncomfortable in your life that's looming?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that I know logically that I should, it's like I want to do in my business, or skills that I actually have to move some things forward in my business, but I don't do it because if it doesn't succeed, then I make it mean something about me. That's the first one. And food, exercise. Yeah, I think most people can relate to that. But for me, I'm in the middle of this right now, and a marketing launch. It's my own thing, pretty much my own thing. And like, I probably haven't put the effort. I coach other people on the very things that I'm not doing. Mm-hmm. Well, because it's their bit. Like, Melissa hired me. I don't care. It's her brand. It's like, that's cool. Like, so that's a place. And then there's also uncomfortable. Raising prices is always a thing. Like owning your value. That's uncomfortable for most people. It's certainly uncomfortable for me because I spent 20 years selling other people's stuff. Like, who cares? I mean, I care because I want to make money, but like, I don't really care if you buy a piece of software. Like, doesn't mean anything to me. There's no emotional attachment versus like, oh, you didn't hire me or you didn't come on my podcast or whatever. So like going after that. And then I think related here to the podcast, I've had a list of people I'd like to extend an invite to for a long time that I relate to as like, I can't get them because they're on big podcasts, but I should just go do it. But that's uncomfortable for me because I'll tell you what's most uncomfortable for me. It's not apparent. Like, I hate being told no. Mm-hmm. And that's a therapeutic thing. And I'm well aware.
I had a huge mindset shift in that a while back.
Oh man. Teach me, please.
Well, it happened early on in ministry. Big accident. It was just horrible and traumatic in so many ways that we don't need to unpack right now. But I felt compelled to go out to their house. And I was holding back because what if they say no? What if they won't let me in? What if they won't even open the door? And then I had this epiphany. Well, that would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? If they did say no, I could just walk away and all is well. What if they say yes? That's when the hard work begins.
Yeah, you're like, oh, then I actually need to deliver value.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then they're going to be, well, as a pastor, then you're like, oh, and then they're going to be sitting there hopefully every Sunday and they're going to be judging me every time with my message and running small groups or
asking difficult questions about why things happen and why things don't happen. And, I didn't take that class in seminary. So, what are you going to say?
Yeah. And then you're like, well, they're not giving as much money as I'd like for our parishioners to give or congregation to live. And then why are they not doing that? Yeah, there's this spiral of all sorts of things. But yeah, the good, that's what comes up for me. There's a whole slew of things. I want to mention something about this before we talk about the benefits of pursuing uncomfortable, because you're writing a book on it. It's what you talk about. I'm sure it's what people come to you for a lot, is the idea of intellectual to emotional shifting in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Working out and eating right is the easiest place to go. Everybody knows that intellectually. Everybody knows that being at a ideal weight, eating good, wholesome foods, and doing something for your body, we all know that logically, including the people that are morbidly obese.
Mm-hmm.
It's well known. This is not a surprise. Yet we don't do it. And everybody knows that lower stress in your life is good for your health. I would assert that most people probably know that holding grudges is not healthy intellectually, but we decide to do it anyway. And I always say the thing that makes the shift for all of us is when you move it away from the brain and move it into the soul, heart, body, and you move it from the I should to I must. And the real life example of this is when people go to the doctor and their doctor says, you need to lose 30 pounds or you're going to develop diabetes. And what that means for you is, one, it's going to be uncomfortable, literally physically uncomfortable, but more likely you're going to die earlier and you're not going to get to meet your grandkids. Then people go, oh, wait, that's an emotional thing. And then they do it. So I think that's I'm speaking for myself here, but also from doing similar work to you with a lot of people, is if you can make that shift, people start to get it. Because up here, your brain can validate, and your brain can logically validate and say that I can start tomorrow or it's not going to matter, because our brain's going to give us all stories too about you to talk. And as a pastor, you hear these things like, well, I've tried with my spouse, or we can't get past this thing, or I've tried eating healthier, I've tried exercising, and I have so much proof that it can't work intellectually that I'm just not going to bother. But if you can move it out of that into more of I must, and it's an emotional thing, then you can make progress. And some people, I'm jealous of these people, are actually really good at intellectualizing things and doing them. And I wish that was a skill that I have, but I think most people, in my experience, are not very good at that. There are some people that can think their way out of almost anything, and it's really impressive, because that is certainly not me.
I think a lot of times the biggest tool I have in my toolbox is asking people a very simple question that people rarely get asked. What do you want? Jason, what do you want?
What do you want? Yeah.
And taking the time to just sit with that really gives you permission to, one, think about what you want, because when do we take the time to do that? But for me, it's a shift from, I don't like the word should, and I always avoid that in my sermons. I never say should. Never, ever do I say should. And I like to think about what works for me is that I could do that. And knowing what I want helps me lean into the I could do that space. But what I help people to do is, there are 4 pillars, I like to say, mostly because I don't have a better word, although I'm not crazy about pillars because it's not a real fancy, pretty word, but so be it. There it is.
Yeah.
There are 4 realms that have to be addressed if you're going to go through something difficult and uncomfortable. And one is know where the finish line is. Where do you have to be to see the checkered flag? Being very clear about that is important, because then from there you can do the intellectual work of plotting out, okay, to get from where I am to right there requires these things. Okay, that's good information to have. Then second is finding your people.
Yeah.
And winnowing your people. I mean, find your people. Find the people, whether it's professionals in a specific realm. If you're going to be an actor and your finish line is getting a role in a film, perhaps you need an acting coach. Find the professionals you need to help you get to that finish line, but also professionals in coaches, counselors, pastors, other people that will help you become the person who does these things. The people you need to support you, and identifying who you need to support you, whether that's family and friends, as well as online groups or support groups, also helps you to understand who doesn't support you.
Yeah.
And I am not an advocate of cutting people out of my life, only in rare instances.
Sure.
But being cognizant of who will support you and putting your energy there.
Yeah.
Then the third pillar is managing your emotions, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that comes up, because that is the essence of why you're not at that finish line yet. So you're going to have to do a lot of work with emotions and becoming that person who is at that finish line, because who you are now is going to be different than the person you are at that finish line.
Yeah.
So we have to grow into that. And then finally, the fourth pillar would be mindset. What mindset do I need in order to move through all of this process? I like affirmations. I like ideas and situations and discomfort in order to help myself move forward, in order to move through all of these other areas. And they aren't sequential, do 1, 2, 3, then 4, but they're all in play at the same time. And when we can work in all of those areas, we can really make some progress, significant progress, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually.
Yeah, Melissa, I heard you mention yes to all that. And that's in your book as well. I'm assuming that's kind of like one of the structures in your book. I love that. And like looking at the different areas, you mentioned a few things that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. One, asking for help.
Yeah.
We're saying, I can't do this on my own. How many times as a pastor do people come in and they think church is the fix? Like just being a member of a church is a fix. And we got like the quick fix. Oh, I'm feeling this. I'm going to go to church and be there on Sundays and maybe I join a group and that's going to be what I need. People are uncomfortable with that. And church is just one example. 2, that people are uncomfortable asking for help. Some people are uncomfortable investing in themselves because sometimes they don't believe they're worth it. And I don't know if you disagree with this, but I would say my experience is that women are much more likely to not invest in themselves because of like, they're not worth it, or the kid, family, kids first, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the things you just mentioned aren't free. Hiring a coach, going to a church shouldn't really be free. I mean, if you're a good church member, there's usually, you don't have to give money, but it's usually part of the thing. Counseling, therapy, joining a mastermind, those things aren't necessarily free. At least I don't know any of our, if you're a coach and you're free, you're not probably a coach, because then you're not really doing it as a business. You're doing it as a charity, or maybe you're a billionaire and you just like to coach people. Not doing that. And then the last thing I'd say people are really uncomfortable with, and I'm guilty of this sometimes too with my coach, is actually doing the work when you get the support. Mm-hmm. Like if I hire you as my coach, we're going to have some deep conversations. We're going to do the thing. We're going to have great sessions most likely, but what am I going to do for the other, 172 hours or whatever it is between when you see each other weekly? Am I willing to do the work that I said I'm going to do? Probably see this as a pastor all the time is, I'm going to come in and talk to you about my breakdown with my spouse or work, or I'm feeling, spiritually misaligned. Great. We're going to have a session, and then you're going to commit to some things. Well, did you do any of these things? Did you move anything forward? And people are uncomfortable doing that because what people are very comfortable with, and I'm speaking to myself as well, is being busy.
Well, and this goes back to what you were speaking of before. When we do make these tiny steps, we're going to feel good.
Yeah.
I mean, even if it's not easy yet, we're going to feel some success. And helping people connect with that is very powerful. It's potent. When those first 5 pounds come off the scale, when I'm eating well, when I can touch my toes with all of my palms instead of my fingertips, that feels amazing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So connecting people with those feelings of progress, the little bitty steps make a big difference. That's a huge motivator.
Yeah.
Also, investing in something keeps us accountable. If I'm paying you, I'm not going to ignore you.
Some people do. Not many.
Yeah.
But yeah, every now and then there's somebody like, why are you, well, this is something that I've gotten a lot more comfortable with, is be like, why are you paying me? Right? Like, you hired me as your coach. Why are you paying me? Because it's obvious you're not really into something. And I'm actually like, I'm far enough along in my business now where I'm comfortable doing that. When I first started out, no way was I going to say it, because I'm like, oh boy, like that, like, what does that mean about me? Yeah. And like also, but owning when you're not doing the work, that's not necessarily a wrong thing, but like owning that, hey, church is arguably the best example on the planet of this. Is, yeah, I'm a church. I go to church, but like, am I doing anything in between for anything about that part of my life? Maybe, maybe not. I'd say a lot of people do. Some people don't.
How is your life different because of that? And if it's not, then yeah. I'm interrupting, and I'm sorry. I apologize for that. I had someone question me on that once because I was paying this person to coach me, and I wasn't doing the work for a short period of time. And this person in our next meeting said, Melissa, I'm confused. You articulated this as a priority, and then you haven't made it a priority. So which is true?
Good coaching.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, you're right. I want it to be a priority, and it won't be unless I make it. So that is what I want.
Yeah. Oh, good coach. That's good. Mm-hmm. Good reflection. Be like, oh, that hurt. That stings in the best way possible. That's like the bump you need. That's what you pay that person for.
Right.
Yeah. Because most of us aren't reliable to ourselves. At least not 100% of the time. We're reliable to choose comfort or easy, because that's, our brains are, in some ways, we're fighting against nature with all of when we choose to pursue uncomfortable, we're actually fighting against how our brains are built. Really, like science will tell you. That's what we're done. I want to wrap up today by talking about some success stories that you have in any of the context, and maybe even the 2016 Cubs. I don't know. No.
Well,
where did they pursue the uncomfortable? No, I'm kidding. We could, but
how many hours do we have, Jason? Because
I know, like, you thought this was going to be you talking to the pastor, Melissa, but we're just going to talk Cubs. I'm not a Cubs fan. I'm a Twins fan. So I have no, it's been wildly uncomfortable since 1991 for me.
I understand.
And I believe we've lost 19 games in a row in the playoffs, most all of them to the Yankees. So it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's for a different podcast. But yeah, let's talk about some success stories you have with congregation, clients, things that people have taken your courses, stories I'm sure you've gotten from your books. Like, what are some success stories that come to mind if you say, hey, like, tell me about some people that you know that have really pursued the uncomfortable and what the difference has made for them?
Absolutely. I love talking about success stories.
Me too.
I consult with some churches that are stuck, and I go in and I teach principles of family systems. We may know that better as emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. Family systems came about from Dr. Murray Bowen and his work with schizophrenics. It taught us to think systemically when it comes to understanding human behavior and societal behavior. So, using those principles and helping institutions, people, families that are stuck, that is powerful, powerful stuff. having an understanding of those things can really bring all of these things to light so that they can be dealt with. And again, it's up to the people in the institution to make the choice to deal with the things. Most recently, I consulted with a church that was
what does it mean when what do you mean by a church is stuck? Like, how would, from an outsider looking in, how would I know a church was stuck, or what would that mean to me as somebody who's not involved in the church?
Okay, well, we understand this personally too. We're just not making progress. We're not growing in the way we want to grow. Churches like to have their sanctuaries packed. Growth happens in a lot of ways. We like the numbers to be growing, but also spiritual growth. All of those things seem to come together. So when we experience a church that's stagnant or not growing, we'll see a decline measured numerically and in what the church is doing outside of its doors for other people. What kind of outreach is it doing? The amount of energy present in ministries that are currently still happening. Another sign of a church in decline or that's stuck is a lot of talk about the good old days instead of making the good old days today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's pretty clear when you're in a place of vitality versus a place of not vital. Yeah. And, again, the forces of life and death are always present, personally, institutionally, in a family setting, corporate setting. And it's just a matter of encouraging the growth and not the stagnation. So recently I worked with a church that was stuck, and it's always, always, always some unfinished emotional business. And 99% of the time it's going to be grief or grudge holding. So identifying those and helping people to heal from those things then frees them up. And it's uncanny, Jason. This can be generations prior.
Sure.
I mean, it can be generations before anyone that is currently there was even alive, but that unfinished emotional business is passed down in the DNA until it is healed. I mean, we see this in families with abuse, right?
Oh, yeah.
Or addiction or what have you. Until someone heals, it's going to be passed down.
Yeah. The
same is true in institutions as well. And what is more tightly knit institution than a church? Or, a synagogue or whatever faith gathering place you have, because that's where mom and dad were married. That's where we buried grandma and grandpa. That's where our children are blessed and all of those things. There's a lot of emotion tied up in our places of worship.
Yeah.
So healing those things. If you read some books, the literature, it's just staggering how uncanny this is. For instance, there was a church, this isn't one I consulted with, but one I studied, that it had 500 people. They had a disagreement. The church split pretty evenly, so pretty close to 250 and 250. And there was a decline after that, which is pretty normal. But then as each church, and you can look at either one, as each of them started to gain momentum again, the closer they got to 250, then things would fall apart. They just could not breach that ceiling. Until generations later, they went back and understood why they had split to begin with, and they healed that, even though they weren't even alive when it happened.
Yeah.
But they healed that, and then that church that did that grew exponentially.
That's so interesting. I'm thinking about and I forget the principle of you can only have about 250 people in your network, and then after that it just becomes, and you may know the name of this, but there's the idea of the same happens I do a lot of work with startups. The same happens as companies grow. Mm-hmm. You get to this point where you hit this, it's almost, and it's not exactly 250, but you hit this point where there's a thing, like you said, in a church, it's a trauma, but there's you get that many people, there's just so many feelings and emotions and past and future and different goals and everything. That's really fascinating that you saw that same pattern repeat, even though nobody even probably knew it was 250. Yeah. How would you know? That's really fascinating.
So you go back, and when you do this work, you have to do detective work. You have to go back and look at records. You have to distill the data. You have to look for patterns. And, look beyond the institution itself, what's going on in the community, what's going on in all of these ways. And you're going to see patterns, and it's going to rise to the top what the issue is.
Yeah.
I think ecologically, what you were describing, there's a term called carrying capacity. That an environment can only sustain so much.
Yeah.
And unless the systems and structures are grown, then it can't support more than.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa. I want to wrap and talk about your book, your new book coming out in 2023. We're not going to hold you to a date here, because some of it is in your control and some of it is not. But we're going to talk about your book. And people listening, no surprise, the book is called Pursuing Uncomfortable. I always love to ask authors, because I am going to make a declaration. I will never be an author because I hate writing, which means I'll probably end up writing a book someday.
So you're going to have to write a book now.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm like, I'm talking to someone whose topic is pursuing uncomfortable. I'm like, I walked into that. You trapped me. That was a trap, Melissa. You did that you mind melded me. But so you have a book coming out called Pursuing Uncomfortable. How did you know that you needed to write this book?
Funny thing. I was in a conversation on LinkedIn. I don't even remember.
Which is where all the best book ideas come, in LinkedIn, of course.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah, this is it.
I don't even remember what the post was about, but someone said, "Oh, this is so uncomfortable." And I said, shouldn't that be a thing? Shouldn't we pursue that discomfort? Isn't that how we grow? And then I wrote the comment, that's going to be the title of my next book, Pursuing Uncomfortable.
There it is.
So then there it was. And yeah.
And once you have a title, the rest is easy. Then you just, write 300 pages or whatever, and you're good.
Well, and it stuck with me. That concept wouldn't let me go.
Yeah, I mean,
we can say something and, it's gone the next day, but then we say something and it grabs us and it doesn't let us go. And this was one of those things that wouldn't let me go. So I had to wrestle with it.
I've had quite a few authors on this podcast, and I've learned to ask that question. And you can't see it here in the video, but above you can see a few of them. But I have a whole shelf of books from guests, and I asked this because, without a doubt, every author I've ever talked to, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, will be like, I had to write that book. Mm-hmm. It's not really so much like, I decided to write a book. It's like, I had to write the book.
Yeah.
Almost like
book was in me.
Yeah. Like, right. Like, and I still have no idea what that feels like. I think this is how this podcast was. I'm like, I feel like I need to do a podcast. This is probably a similar experience, or I need to create this marketing thing. But so you knew you needed to write the book. You got inspired by LinkedIn, which is just the most beautiful. Like, what are the movie rights to this story? You're like, I was on a post on LinkedIn, which is like the most unromantic way to start a.
Right.
You're like, somebody hit me up on LinkedIn. Yeah, what a great origin story. Like, people are like, I was walking through the streets of Paris one night and I saw that. You're like, no, I was just like a LinkedIn post. And I made a comment, but that's actually pretty cool. So you wrote the book, you're writing the book now. What do you want people to get from the book, other than obviously the point is that I think your big idea here is you need to pursue the uncomfortable if you want to get what you really want out of life. What else do you want people to get out of the book when they read it?
Be mindful of which uncomfortable you're clinging to. Life is hard. It is always hard, but you get to choose which kind of hard you have in your life, and pursue the uncomfortable that's going to get you what you want. Don't just live with the uncomfortable that's present. Decide if that is what you want. And if it's not, pursue the uncomfortable that will get you past it.
What if people don't know what they want? Or they say they don't know what they want?
Then start there.
Yeah. Uncomfortable declaring what they want.
Yeah.
Or uncomfortable. You and I as coaches know that a lot of people hire us because they don't know what they want.
Yeah.
That,
and
they don't know what they want.
There's not a right answer.
No,
Jason,
yeah.
What you want in your life is what you want.
Or also I want a job, or I want to make more money, and those things are the output, but what is it that you really want?
Yeah. And
that's an uncomfortable conversation, because I speaking for myself, I don't remember I just don't know that as children we're ever taught that. Most people are like, hey, why do you want to make more money? Nobody ever, it's like, you need to go out in the world and make a lot of money. Like the story, especially in like American culture, Western culture. Why? Oh, so I can, because that's the thing to do. But like, how often do you get asked like what for?
And this was an important question for me to answer recently because I really cut back in what I do with my consulting business because it wasn't giving me the life I wanted.
Yeah.
I want my time. I have a teenager and I want that time to connect right now. I don't want to run an empire. That takes a lot of hours and a lot of work, and that's not what I want. I want simple and I want connected.
Yeah. You want to pay the bills, hopefully put some money away, like do the things you want to do, but not have to, like bury yourself in the ground to do it, which which author, coach, pastor, podcaster, and Cubs fan, those things take a lot of time.
Well,
especially the Cubs fan.
Really,
there's 162 games plus if they make the playoffs.
The Cubs fan is a big commitment emotionally and time wise.
Emotionally, and if you go to games and money wise too, it's not cheap to go to sporting events.
Right. But all of those things, they just describe the same thing. I do the one thing. There are a lot of different titles that can be put on it depending on where I'm doing it. But what I do is I hold space for people so that they can be authentically themselves and grow into what and who they want to be.
Love it. Melissa, I am so glad we made this happen. Glad to see you again after a couple years. It's so fun to have awesome guests come back on here with the new stuff. I want to wish you the very best with the book launch sometime in 2023. You heard it here. This is my little version of giving Melissa a hard time about some accountability. And can't wait to read it. I would love to put it on my shelf, but you have to sign it for me. I will buy it, send it to you, sign it for me, get it up here on the shelf. Thank you for all the good you do in the community you're in and the greater community. I know you run an online business too, so people can interact with you anywhere, and people get to interact with you in person in some small towns is the way you like to say small. That's the word you like to use.
I do. I love my small farming communities. If I can't see a cornfield within 30 seconds, then it's too big for me.
So good to have you. Great to see you again. We'll have
Thanks,
you come
Jason.
back on again soon. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking to Cool People with Jason Frizzell. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and give us a shout out, or take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. If something from today's episode piqued your interest and you'd like to connect, email us at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com. We love hearing from our listeners because you're cool people too.